You went to a gun show recently. Could you describe what that was like?
Yeah, I've been involved in gun violence prevention for a number of years, and I'm very familiar with data on gun shows that I've seen, but I had never been to one myself. So, in July of 2007, I decided to go to a gun show that was held at the Richmond Showplace in Richmond, Virginia, and it was a very interesting experience. Number one, there were a lot of obviously firearm vendors on hand. There were some other vendors that were selling other things. But really, what I went in there that day looking for was really three different things. Number one would be how many unlicensed vendors were selling guns that day. In other words, how many unlicensed vendors were selling guns without conducting background checks on purchasers. So that's one thing I wanted to see. A second thing I wanted to see was law enforcement monitoring the sales that were going on at the gun show. That was the second thing. And then the third thing I really wanted to see was the issue of straw purchases, whereas that's a case where someone with a clean criminal record buys a gun for someone who is prohibited under federal law from purchasing firearms. So basically, you ask someone with a clean criminal record to fill out the background check form when you go to buy the gun. Then once the gun's actually bought, the gun is simply handed to you by your friend who filled out the form, and you either pay them with money or drugs or whatever the arrangement is. So in being at the show that day, I saw a few different things. Number one, I did see private sales of firearms take place right in front of me with no background check whatsoever. One thing I remember was two gentlemen meeting near the front of the gun show, and one of them selling a handgun and a box of ammunition to the other with no paperwork whatsoever. It wasn't just that a background check wasn't conducted. It was a situation where an ID wasn't even checked, a driver's license wasn't even presented. And it was clear that the man buying the gun could have been a convicted felon, a domestic abuser, could have been prohibited under federal law for a number of different reasons from buying the gun. The person selling it simply couldn't know. Then I noticed that there were other unlicensed sellers at the show. There were individuals that had tables at the show that clearly were marked unlicensed vendor, no background check required. So it wasn't just people milling about the show, but also people that actually had paid to have tables to sell their guns from their tables. In terms of the issue of straw purchases, I did see some very suspicious activity that day. I saw young men come into the show and literally one man fill out a background check form while another young man looked over his shoulder at what he was filling out, and then the other man who wasn't filling out the form was also interacting with the person who was selling the guns, asking questions about the guns, pointing guns out. And can I be 100% sure that was a straw purchase? No. But if I was a law enforcement officer, I certainly would have wanted to have wandered over there and asked a few questions, which leads me to that last question I asked, which was law enforcement monitoring the show? And the answer really is no. When I walked in the show that day, there were two Henrico County police officers at the front of the show. And their job was simply to check guns that were coming in, to make sure that they were unloaded and then tagged, basically to mark that they were safe and could be sold within the confines of the show. But I spent, I think, over about 2 or 2.5 hours at the show that day, and in that time I never saw those two police or any other police or ATF agents patrolling the show. There was simply no above-board monitoring of the sales that were going on by any police officers or law enforcement that I could identify, including of some of these suspicious straw purchase type sales that I saw. Now, is it possible that there were undercover officers there that day? Again, it is possible, but again, based on some of the activity I saw that I think would have been obvious for someone to monitor, I don't believe that was happening there that day. And then the last thing that I think would be a concern to a lot of Americans who probably have never attended a gun show themselves is some of the Nazi paraphernalia that I saw at the show. It was everywhere. One of the things that I bought that day was a replica of a 1932 campaign poster for Adolf Hitler. And this was an item, it wasn't an item that was being sold by one vendor. There were vendors all throughout the gun show who were selling replica posters from Nazi campaign posters, actual Nazi helmets and knives and guns that were used by Nazi soldiers. I saw some literature on Jews from the period of World War II that was produced by the Nazis, and other things that were really quite disturbing to me. And one thing that was really amazing is as I walked around with the show with that poster, which I really just wanted to buy just to produce evidence that that these types of things are sold at gun shows. As I walked around for about a half hour or 45 minutes after buying it, no one so much as batted an eyelash at me. I was convinced that someone would say to me, why did you buy that? Why are you carrying that around? But I literally might as well have been carrying a pair of sneakers around that I had bought at a mall. No one so much as looked at me twice. And then there's a lot of literature beyond, some of that Jewish-related literature at the gun show that was of concern to me. One of the books that I saw for sale that day was the Turner Diaries, which is a book with, again, a lot of neo-Nazi racist propaganda and just a lot of hate, and it's a book about people who kill federal agents because of anger over gun laws, and then basically enacted genocide in America to wipe out all non-white races. And there were other books like Unintended Consequences, and there were books about how to attack the American military, and a whole bunch of other topics that to me were quite disturbing.